Just as I thought. You've got that pointy bit from the end of your clarinet stuck in your throat. That was clumsy of you.
I didn't. It was SpongeBob.
Well, there's nothing to do for it but surgery.
Ooh.
Now's my chance to try out my new invention. The solution to your problem.
A submarine.
That's right, Squidward. Let me show you.
Cue the intro! Ahoy, mateys, and welcome aboard to the only podcast that could even come close to the magic of Miss Frizzle's school bus. I'm ready! A SpongePod Squarecast. I'm your host, Captain Eric, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here as we continue our sail through the 4th season of SpongeBob SquarePants. Today's episode is all about adventure, taking the plunge into the unknown. And although you may be entering a strange world, at least you know it's a more advertised one. Our SpongeBob episode today is the Squidtastic Voyage, of course, a homage to the 1966 film The Fantastic Voyage, the sci-fi which was written by Jerome Bixby and Otto Clement. The screenplay was then written by Harry Kleiner, and the movie was directed by Richard Fleischer. The Fantastic Voyage has been parodied and referenced by many films and animated properties. And today it is SpongeBob's turn to take this concept, slap it on the grill, and flip it over when it's ready and sizzling. Squidtastic Voyage was storyboard directed by Luke Brookshire and Tom King, who wrote this episode alongside Danny McKillie. Our animation director is Tom Yasumi, our technical director is Vincent Waller, and our supervising producer is Paul Tibbett. I also would like to give a massive shout out to Clint Bond, who is making his first appearance as a storyboard supervisor as a part of this episode, following the one, the only Sherm Cohen, who is one of the biggest storyboard supervisors in SpongeBob's early history, starting back with Season 2, and would continue to be a part of SpongeBob's history even up to the first season of Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Under Years, and the first season of the Patrick Star Show. So even though Sherm Cohen may not be our storyboard supervisor moving forward up until season 9 when he returns to the position for a few episodes, but Sherm's contributions to the world of SpongeBob SquarePants will continue on. So thank you, Sherm, for your work in this position, and welcome Clint to the world of storyboard supervision.
Congratulations.
You know, when I think back to my childhood, when I think back to around 5 or 6 years old, I feel like I could have named 4 or 5 different animated shows, even at that time, that had some sort of either one-off adventure, one episode that took place inside of a character, or an entire B-plot where there were misadventures of certain characters within another. For that one specifically, I'm talking about Bloaty the Tick and Squirmy the Ringworm, who had a few episodes to themselves within Rocko's Modern Life, and they were characters that lived within Spunky, Rocko's dog. So, not necessarily characters entering the body, but the idea of using the insides of a creature as a means of storytelling is certainly something that was being used everywhere. But specifically when it comes to the Fantastic Voyage, that alone has been parodied through many different animated shows, and even up to this episode, I believe this is the 9th Nicktoon to parody the Fantastic Voyage. Up to this point, and a few of these I specifically remember. Right after Bloaty and Squirmy, the second episode I think of is the episode of the Rugrats where they enter the insides of Chucky Finster through the use of their lazy beam to collect a lone watermelon seed that Chucky had eaten, and out of the fear of that seed growing into an entire watermelon plant, the Rugrats enter within the unknown insides of Chucky Finster. From there, we had Blazing Entrails from the Ren and Stimpy Show, Internal Affairs from Ah Real Monsters, Fantastic Voyage from The Angry Beavers, Fishing for Trouble from Cat Dog, Tiny Timmy from The Fairly Odd Parents, Nano Zim from Invader Zim, and Journey to the Center of Carl from The Adventures of Jimmy Neutron, Boy Genius. Now, while that was happening on Nickelodeon, I'm sure outside of Nickelodeon, you can think of many different properties that dealt with going inside of another character for whatever purpose and by any means. Of course, you can think of the Magic School Bus, Osmosis Jones, Ozzy and Drix, its TV show adaptation. There are plenty of different TV shows that have had this referenced of the Fantastic Voyage. But for SpongeBob, this is certainly a voyage that I honestly feel bad for Squidward for. I don't know if this is where we can say this is the genesis of the Squidward episode train, where there's just torture on Squidward for seemingly no reason. You know, it's okay for Squidward to get his comeuppance when he deserves it, but then we eventually find ourselves in this territory where Squidward is just getting tortured for the sake of comedy. And that's where things kind of change a little bit. I think that's where this may start. Maybe you can point to an earlier episode. I'm certainly not thinking of one for right now because of the amount of torture I saw happen in front of me, and honestly, I really wanted to make the joke that this was the genesis because of how many Sonic the Hedgehog references I think are within this episode. I'm not 100% sure, but go on this voyage with me and maybe you'll agree. Right out of the gate, one thing I have to say about this episode is the title card is extremely muted for the tone it's trying to give across. And what I mean by that is when you look at this title card, this, bar none, has to be one of the most visually interesting, creative title cards we have ever had in SpongeBob SquarePants history. What are we even looking at? Then you see the title, Squidtastic Voyage. Well, if you even know of the reference, then immediately you know that you are looking at the insides of, most likely, Squidward Tentacles. What a title card, sci-fi, excitement, horror, adventure, yet the music that is decided for this intro is extremely muted. Maybe that was a choice because we do have the narrator, the French narrator, helping us ease us into the story by trying to give us the ambiance of the underwater scenery of Bikini Bottom, but SpongeBob, and we're not really given a time of day that this is happening. Of course, if it was extremely early in the day or late at night, it would be understandable for there to be a disturbance, but SpongeBob is playing a really funky beat, but is playing it at a volume that I would say is excessive. We haven't seen the pineapple shake this much to music since SpongeBob brought the jellyfish home and thought that he could keep the wild jellyfish as a pet and decided that he was going to have an all-night rock party with the jellyfish. So as we are eased into this situation, we have no idea what's going on. We haven't seen the pineapple shake like this in so long. And as we are shown with what's going inside, SpongeBob and Patrick are practicing their breakdancing moves to a song that I can only say was reminding me of a song by Black Box, which, let me get the name of it.
This is amazing.
I think it's Everybody. I had the beat in my head. I don't have a catalog of the name of every single song. I just remember, yeah, Everybody, Everybody by Black Box. Oh, there's an ad. Boo. We don't need to hear that. No ads here on I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. But, yeah, the song that SpongeBob and Patrick was listening to, an extremely catchy beat. I have to say that I'm a little disappointed in Squidward for not, getting more involved with that kind of music. Oh, here we go. There we go. Just a little bit of a beat there for you. This is what SpongeBob and Patrick were dancing to right now. Right here. I can only give you a little bit. But yeah, that was the song I was thinking of as this intro was playing out. As they are breakdancing, Squidward next door, I mentioned, was not too happy about the music playing at this volume, as he was the last time. But let me say, Squidward's a pretty fair neighbor. Squidward will let the music go on for an excessive amount of time before he starts intervening. And even here, he, decides, you can clearly hear from within Squidward's home. I'm getting distracted by the music video by Black Box now. You can hear within Squidward's home the music going on, and he's trying to play his clarinet. So it's not like he's immediately ticked off at the beginning. He's been trying to ignore it, which is really commendable. I have to say that, it's not like the music was just turned on and Squidward immediately went from 0 to 11. You can see there is maybe a minute or two where Squidward was just trying to ignore it. And that's the best he can do. But once a few of his pictures start falling off of the wall, that's it. He's had enough. There's no even reason to talk to SpongeBob. Maybe for Squidward's point of view, there's no reason to talk. I imagine that if he walked out of his house, walked over to the pineapple, knocked on the door, or at the very least walked in and tried to be civil, maybe the music could have been turned down, although I feel like in the direction of Squidward taking those routes, instead of getting angry, he would still end up with a pie on his face in some way. I know, that's exactly what I'm talking about with Squidward. He should be the one that sets up the trap and puts the pie on it where the pie gets in his face. He shouldn't be the one just getting a pie in the face. Actually, you know what? That's funny. What am I saying? It's a pie. Anybody getting hit with a pie in the face. I was using that as a metaphor because we all know that Squidward gets hit with a lot worse than a pie. If all you have to worry about is a pie getting in your face when you turn a corner, if you're one of the Three Stooges or something, that's not a bad life. But Squidward has to deal with Krabby Patties, clarinets, big people getting thrown at him, anchovies coming in and demanding Krabby Patties. There's a lot, so I have to be a little bit more fair with Squidward sometimes. Either way, this is a moment where Squidward, instead of being a nice neighbor and walking over and talking, he's beyond that. So he fights fire with fire, and just like last time, decides to blast clarinet music outside of his window to combat whatever music SpongeBob is playing. Inadvertently, without Squidward knowing, one of the dance moves that SpongeBob was trying, the inverted whirlpool, I believe. All of the names for the breakdancing moves all had nautical terms. SpongeBob was upside down, spinning on his head, and had spun at such a velocity with his legs out that he essentially became a helicopter, flew right outside of the pineapple, and right into the window of Squidward's home. So regardless of Squidward, he could have ignored it fully and just stood there and ate the house shaking. He still would have been hit by SpongeBob. There was no avoiding SpongeBob and his calamity. SpongeBob knocks into Squidward, knocking the clarinet right down his throat. Hilariously, horizontally in his throat. And for anything that I can point out in this episode that I may not like or that I would have done differently, there is one part of this episode that it has the gold honor as of now for having one of the best visual adult jokes that SpongeBob has had in a long time. As Squidward has had the clarinet lodged in his throat, SpongeBob tries his best to get the clarinet unlodged, even by going inside of Squidward's mouth. And we can see everything that's going on, so we know the noises as to what's going on. But from outside of Squidward's home, we see a mother walking with her child, walking past and hearing those noises, and then covering the ears of her child. A fantastic visual joke for the parents in the room, and it's great. It's absolutely wonderful. This episode knocks it out of the park. Back inside of Squidward's house, SpongeBob has successfully received the clarinet out within from Squidward, but one part of that clarinet has been left within. The top part, the reed of the clarinet, has been lodged within Squidward's throat, and every few seconds, it's almost like Squidward cannot talk without some sort of clarinet squeal or squeak coming out of his throat. And throughout this entire process, anytime Squidward shows any bit of discomfort, the animators are going wild with the expressions of Squidward clearly gasping for air in certain parts and is clearly uncomfortable about this piece of musical hardware stuck in his throat. And at this point, SpongeBob has only one idea, and it's to bring Squidward to his good buddy Sandy Cheeks. I can tell you that I don't remember if I watched this live when it premiered. I know I watched these pairings of episodes the first week of its premiere, but I can tell you that the first time that I saw Squidward within that helmet, it was a big deal for me because this is the first time that Squidward has gone inside of Sandy's tree dome. Believe it or not, this is the very first time, and just to keep track of things, this is also the third time that the helmets within Sandy's tree dome have been worn a little differently than what we're used to. This is the episode 1 style of helmet wearing, where there's also an opening of the helmet on the top, where usually Sandy can then insert water or tea bags. Not like she's playing Call of Duty or Halo or anything, but back in episode 2, Tea at the Tree Dome of the entire series, that was the ultimate ending, the ending of the episode, the two characters receiving water in their new helmets, and then tea so they can enjoy tea alongside Sandy. This is Squidward's first time, and the second time was also Chimp's Ahoy, so maybe there's this tradition where when new characters are entering the tree dome for the very first time, these helmets have to be worn in this way. Maybe that's a legitimate thing. That's the only explanation I can think of, other than if it's just truly needed for comedic purposes, although in this episode it was off-putting. Not in the initial watch-through, because I can tell you, you're not noticing that top part if you're like me and you're seeing Squidward in there for the first time and you're like, whoa, hey, what are you doing here? I've never seen you with that helmet on. It might be in the second or third airing where you're like, hey, wait a minute. What's that opening doing there? But it's there. It's all right. It's just, there might be a thing with when a new character is inside of Sandy's tree dome for a first time. They have to wear the helmet like that. That's actually interesting. I haven't thought of that until, honestly, right now, live recording this podcast. But Sandy, as smart as she is, I don't know. I have to question some things in this episode, just ever so slightly. Sandy has the most convoluted means of getting this reed out of Squidward's throat. She brings up the idea of surgery, which is certainly something that could happen if you have an item lodged in your throat. You may have to enter some sort of surgery where they may have to use other means to, unlodge whatever is stuck. But for what ends up happening, it is certainly not unheard of for Sandy to go the sci-fi route. But this is just a wacky idea. She introduces the idea of a submarine, along with this shrinking technology, which I have to say looks awfully familiar to Mermaid Man's utility belt, as in Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4, I believe. Let me double check. Yeah, there we go.
You did it, Goku.
This may just be a theory, but it would make a ton of sense that after Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4, right at the end of that episode, if you remember, the idea was to just shrink everybody down and the entire town to the size of the shrink ray within the utility belt of Mermaid Man, and that would just fix everything. But then Plankton arrives. He was out of town for some sort of trip. Then he comes back and he's a massive guy, and all of a sudden Bikini Bottom is around his size. How the tables have turned. And I have to imagine Mermaid Man not knowing how to reverse this shrinking is, of course, due to his age and possible failing memory. And during that time, studying the belt, Sandy could have reverse engineered the shrinking technology to then use in her own experiments. And here we are. Now she's shrinking submarines down to the size of even tinier than Plankton. Smaller than Plankton. That's incredible. That makes a lot of sense. That's just a theory that Sandy was the one to help reverse engineer that shrinking. And then, of course, saved, I forgot to add that part. She would have been the one to save everybody in Bikini Bottom, get everybody back to the right size, and that's why by the next episode, I know there's that cartoon logic that anything can happen at the end of an episode and everything's just going to reverse back the next week or the next episode. But even within that world, if you happen to ask that question, well, how would you get everybody back to their right size? Well, hand the belt over to Sandy Cheeks. That solves everything. That's my answer. So Sandy has this shrinking technology. She has this submarine. And her idea is to enter through Squidward's head, go through his brain, to then retrieve the reed within his throat. Now, Squidward has every right to be skeptical at this plan, but his one question just confuses me. Although it's right, there's one other question that I have no idea no one had asked before this plan was put into motion. Why do you have to enter through his brain? When his throat is right there, is there something dangerous about entering the mouth, entering the throat from that entry point? That's not made clear. But Squidward's one question is, why can't you just shrink the reed? Which Sandy laughs it off and makes it seem like that would be the hard way of doing things. And the only thing that I can think of that would make sense for Sandy's response to this is her inability to figure out how to shrink a shrink ray down with everybody to have that direct shot. It's one thing to have the giant shrink ray visor, the big machine itself that you can stand under, and it's another thing to attach that to a machine and then shrink that down to size. Maybe Sandy hasn't figured that out. Maybe I'm thinking way too much into it. But if I didn't, then there wouldn't be a podcast, and I kind of like making this podcast, so let me do what I do. Sometimes I think a little bit too much into things. Things just stick around in my brain a little bit too much. Bakes a little longer than you'd think, but what comes out sometimes is genuinely good conversation. Anyway, up to this point in SpongeBob's history, two characters who don't usually get a lot of screen time to interact with one another is that of Squidward and Sandy. And that changes tenfold in this episode between some of their interactions. But this first one that I noted down was so beautiful. Sandy, after she explained everything that was going to happen in the procedure, Squidward had a few more questions, but once it came to knock him out, Sandy is certainly not going to pull out any sort of gases and just uses a good old karate chop to the head and then says,
Sweet dreams, partner.
which put such a smile on my face after feeling that the karate chop itself may have been a little excessive. And as I wrote down after this scene, the karate chop to Squidward was beautifully sweet and savage. Of course, if Captain Eric is talking about anything related to being savage, there's only one thing that could mean.
I got you for 3 minutes. 3 minutes of playtime.
For as smart as Sandy is, she can certainly make some glaring mistakes in her plans ever so often. One of them being trusting SpongeBob to guard such an important piece of technology, even if you're going to be away for only a few minutes. Do you not understand the potential that could go wrong in those few minutes? This is a character that is a sponge for chaos. Things happen, so it's your own fault for leaving this guy with this machine and the possibility, of course, of Patrick just waltzing in at any point in time that SpongeBob is around.
Idiot. Hi.
And, of course, almost on schedule, the second Sandy puts SpongeBob in charge of guarding this submarine, and the second she leaves the room to grab whatever it is she is grabbing, Patrick enters the facility that is outside of the tree dome. I forgot to mention, this is not still within Sandy's tree dome. This is one of her usual outside projects. Patrick just waltzes into this situation and is immediately enthralled by this submarine. I have never seen a submarine. I need to see the inside of this submarine. What does it look like? He's excited, but SpongeBob is guarding it with his life, and is making sure that nobody touches it, just like Sandy promised. But one of the unfortunate parts about being SpongeBob is that the logic that is always presented in front of you is just as bendable and moldable as the sponge he is. SpongeBob can be stretched and mashed up, can't feel any pain, and if you present him with logic that he can't really necessarily disagree with, he just rolls with it. Okay, well, that's a thing. Think about it. There are hooks in front of him. He can visually see what the hooks look like, but the second that Patrick presents the idea that it's a carnival, well, this has to be a carnival. Look at the colors. Look at the things you can ride. This is a horsey. Presents that logic, and now SpongeBob rolls with it. There have been plenty of episodes where somebody presents a new idea to SpongeBob, and he just rolls with the idea. That's how he works. That's an unfortunate and positive part of being SpongeBob. You can use it, of course, to your advantages. But in this case, once Patrick brings up the idea of why can't you just guard it from the inside, well, that's the kind of logic that SpongeBob really can't go around. He can't disagree with for some reason. It makes sense. Well, I'm still guarding the sub, and then I can appease Patrick. A win-win situation. So, of course, the two of them enter the sub, and out of all of the buttons and triggers that you can see on this control board, there is one massive orange button with a shrink label on it. Now, I'm surprised Patrick can even read, let alone know that a shrink is just another code name for a therapist. As he reads the word, he goes, you know what? I do have a lot of issues, and hits the button as if he's looking for a therapist. And the machine starts shrinking. The way that this beam comes down, it seems to shrink different matter at different times. It shrinks the sub almost immediately before the different characters within it, and then at different degrees. The shrinking sequence in this episode is one of my favorites. I genuinely love it. And of course, as it's going on, as they are shrinking down, Sandy comes back into the room with a box of acorns. I have no idea what else is in that box, but Sandy legitimately left a piece of technology of this magnitude in the hands of SpongeBob SquarePants to get a box of acorns. Not the smartest, maybe the smartest in Bikini Bottom, but not the smartest in the sea, I'll tell you that much. SpongeBob and Patrick immediately realize that something has gone wrong. Patrick assumes that Sandy has grown, where SpongeBob is of the understanding that they have shrunk down, and into Squidward Tentacles they go. I have, once again, no idea why they just don't enter the mouth. It would be such a short journey, I understand that, but then, of course, we're going to miss out on the possibilities of torturing Squidward through the brain. One of the creative parts, anytime you enter a character's insides, are the way you can interpret certain parts of the body within that show. And I will say, for anyone working on the Squidtastic Voyage, within the inside of Squidward Tentacles is a myriad of different backgrounds and extraordinary pieces of art, unlike we haven't seen within SpongeBob before. There are certainly points in time where creativity can be stretched within SpongeBob, and here you can tell it's the inside of a creature, but it's different. There's something uniquely alien about it. So I have to applaud those who worked on the design of the inside of Squidward. You can understand why just reusing one of those backgrounds as the title card would be an interesting way to start this episode. I applaud that effort as well, too, whoever came up with that idea, unless that was the thought from the beginning. Once SpongeBob and Patrick are let loose within the head of Squidward Tentacles, he is awoken, I was going to say from his anesthesia, but his karate chop coma, wakes up from that, and then Sandy gives him possibly the worst news he could receive other than, you're not going to make it, which is that SpongeBob and Patrick are in your brain. The two least trustworthy characters within a stone's throw of Bikini Bottom are piloting a submarine within your brain.
Don't you just love playing submarine, Gary? Prepare to dive!
There is a moment here, the second moment between Squidward and Sandy, that I needed to bring up. I noted down. There is a very subtle, quick, nervous laugh between the two once it is said again that SpongeBob and Patrick are let loose in Squidward's brain, once he kind of brings it up again. And the two of them share this nervous laugh with one another before Squidward absolutely loses his mind. And I implore you, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go back and watch this sequence. That's a sharing of a similar emotion. They both know exactly what that means. They both know. Come on now. And that little moment they shared, it's so quick, but I rewatched it 2 or 3 times. It's probably my absolute favorite Sandy and Squidward moment up to this point in time. Some little point in their history that they were on the same page and they understood each other. Sandy knows that things are a little messed up, but she's confident that she can help pilot SpongeBob and Patrick through this endeavor.
Good luck.
One thing I have to say about this sequence is right before all of that damage happens within Squidward, when Squidward is just genuinely freaking out about these characters in his body, I really wish they would have saved a lot of the overexpressions that Squidward was having with the clarinet in his throat, the reed in his throat, and they would have toned those down just ever so slightly to then give this over-the-top Squidward manic freak out over these characters in his body. When he freaks out, it honestly, it does go more than he has throughout the entire episode, but for the last couple of minutes or so, you've been used to Squidward and his body kind of freaking out to the reaction of this reed getting stuck in his throat. So it's not like going from 3 to 11 like I would have wanted, where Squidward wakes up from essentially a 0 and goes to an 11. It's as if he was at like a 9 throughout most of this episode. And then, yes, it was turned off. The karate chop knocked out Squidward, but it was still set to 9, essentially. Then you just turned it to 11. Not that much of an increase. Just saying. As they are traveling within the head of Squidward Tentacles, Sandy tries to make contact with our two Squidstronauts, and using the speaker system, decides to phone in to SpongeBob and Patrick. Patrick hears Sandy's voice out of the speaker and for some reason forgets what speakers are, what microphones are, and thinks Sandy is stuck within this device. Pulls out an axe, as if he's Norman Bates or Patrick Bateman, and starts just axing this terminal console, destroying the machines, causing the ship to crash land somewhere within Squidward. This is where the entire story shifts to a real serious tone once Sandy brings up the mention that you guys may kill him. You can't just mess around with what's within Squidward. Squidward even overhears this and gets a little alarmed, but I gotta tell you, even though this is a children's show, you know that you can distort these characters inside and out. It's a cartoon. Everything's going to be okay. There's no need to freak out, genuinely. But the tone of the episode really takes a real shift once that happens. And it's not like anything gets better for Squidward. Once it's brought up that SpongeBob can't drive, things take a turn for the worst. But I have to say, with all of these buttons and knobs, all of these intricate different ways that the ship can crash land for that need to happen in the story, what's with Patrick pulling out an axe? I don't know if this was also the start or the continuation of Patrick just being random for the sake of being random. What am I talking about? The guy just dumped mustard on himself for a dry rub on last week's episode. So his randomness is just continuing on. But the randomness for the sake of comedy is one thing. The randomness for the sake of, well, we need this part in the story to happen, so then Patrick just randomly pulls out an axe. There are so many other buttons that could have been pressed, so many other things in the ship that could have been touched, that could have necessitated this ship to crash land. But either way, another little nitpick I have is not really on anything that anybody created this episode has to say about. It's really coming from Sandy Cheeks, who assumes that once she brings up the idea that piloting this ship is someone who has never passed their boatmobile license, their boatmobile driving test to get their license, and to drive this ship, it is 10 times more complicated than a boatmobile. But I have to say, that Sandy is equivocally wrong in the fact that SpongeBob has never been able to successfully drive a boatmobile. In fact, the one time that he has, he not only drove it better than any other average citizen in Bikini Bottom, but it was with the assistance of one Patrick Star and the use of a walkie-talkie within his head. But now he has Patrick Star right next to him, and ironically, they are both within the head of another character. So I think SpongeBob is in a fair place in driving this vehicle, although I know that I am completely wrong in that endeavor. Once SpongeBob puts pedal to the metal, this ship goes into hyper overdrive, crashing into each and every part of Squidward Tentacles. This is a torture fest for Squidward. It's not necessarily a funny one. What we end up getting into is SpongeBob and Patrick treating Squidward's body like a pinball machine, and they're the pinball. Which, speaking of pinball, one of the Sonic references that happened in this episode, it's not necessarily a blatant reference to anything Sonic the Hedgehog related, but it's a moment that happens within this episode that reminds me of something from Sonic. But on the Sega Genesis and Sega Game Gear, there's a game called Sonic Spinball, a spin-off of the series of Sonic the Hedgehog games that takes Sonic and brings him into this world that is more or less designed like a pinball machine, and it is your goal to get through each and every level, collecting the Chaos Emeralds, getting to Dr. Robotnik, that we knew of him at the time, Dr. Eggman. Now, in this game, the first level boss, there is horrifyingly horrific music playing and some sound effects every time you hit this boss, and there's moments that you can get Sonic like stuck within these two areas that you are hitting his tail and his head, and you're just bouncing up and down, up and down. And the way that this ship, this submarine, bounces around Squidward's brain, on the top of his brain, hitting his skull, up and down, reminded me so much of that sequence. And I wasn't even going to say anything about it if it wasn't for the fact that there are other Sonic the Hedgehog references in this episode that I'll bring up. I can't be the only one who thought of that. If you know what I'm talking about, if you remember that first boss of Sonic Spinball, you'll know. If you know, you know. It's during this moment in time that Sandy decides to whip out the waiver, which should have been one of the first things that Sandy had done before even karate chopping Squidward. He could sue her. He could legitimately walk out right now and sue Sandy, I believe, in some way. There has to be some sort of laws that were broken beforehand. Sandy, as far as I know, is not a certified medical professional and shouldn't be performing any sort of surgeries on another individual. I could be wrong on that. But the fact that Sandy has a waiver involved leads me to believe that she probably should have had that out first. Another little blunder of Sandy Cheeks in this episode. For as smart as she is, however she got the shrinking technology, making this submarine, it's all impressive. But letting SpongeBob guard the machine itself, not pulling out the waiver until this moment in time. Now, she still gets a signature. Squidward signs it before he even knows what it is. And she even lies to Squidward that it's his autograph for whenever he becomes famous, which is just feeding into the ego of Squidward. Not cool. That's not cool, boo-boo. Not cool at all. I have no idea. While you're in the midst of possibly killing this guy, you're covering your hindquarters with a legal waiver and then just feeding into this man and his hopes and dreams. Maybe it's in that moment of, well, give him his rose where he could possibly perish any moment in time. Let him enjoy that thought. Yeah, I could understand that argument. But Sandy has already made one too many blunders in this episode for me to let anything slide. But as they are crashing around, I gotta say, this episode is not as fun as some of these other episodes that I have thought about when it comes to exploring the insides of a character. They don't really take advantage of that as much as I would have wanted. There is certainly a lot of exploring through the head of Squidward, but most of that is just us seeing shots of the outside of Squidward and the parts where you can see the submarine bouncing on the inside of his body from the outside of. You just see the bumps. We don't get to see those from the inside. And as the machine is breaking, it ends up in his stomach, which is genuinely another interesting part of this episode. It doesn't remind me of a stomach, and it actually looks like something you would see from within Banjo-Kazooie. It looks like a stomach in the sense of when you see the entrance and then you see the acid, your mind can only think of one other spot this could possibly be within the body. But as you are entering it, when you see that little hole into what possible organ are you entering, honestly, when you first see that entrance, don't tell me that you didn't think of, oh, SpongeBob and Patrick are heading to the exit. Already? Come on now. The way that it's framed there seems like the exit point, but it's not. It is simply an entry point into the stomach, which is genuinely interesting, but stomach acid is dangerous. It's possibly the worst thing if you are ever digested by an animal to come into encounter of. Ew, gross. And as SpongeBob and Patrick are freaking out in this situation, a few ideas are starting to brew, including a brilliant idea by Patrick Star, who, after drinking a little bottle of cola, seems to come up with the exact right plan, bouncing off of Sandy's initial idea, is that they are out of fuel. And if they can somehow get some natural gas around the ship itself, that may be able to refill some of the fuel tanks and help get them out of there. Patrick, or should I say Dr. Professor Patrick in this situation, right after drinking the cola, comes up with the idea of drinking cola, making Squidward burp to create some of those gas bubbles. He immediately stuns even Sandy in the fact that he is correct, and it seems like that piece of intelligence is just a quick in and out type ordeal right after he drinks soda, which then he reverts right back to the good old Patrick Star that we know and love. It's another part of this episode that reminds me of Sonic the Hedgehog, this idea of using bubbles and their ability to hold pockets of air, which essentially that's what they are, but they're used to get out of sticky situations. There is nothing more classic in Sonic the Hedgehog. If you are a young player of that series, especially those classic games, when you are stuck in one of those water levels, and God forbid you are nowhere near any one of those pockets of air bubbles, and you are running out of time and that music starts to increase, oh boy, that's where some of my anxiety has come from. But another little reference, I feel, to Sonic the Hedgehog here. But as they use these air bubbles, of course, Sandy takes that idea of Patrick's, forcing Squidward to drink some soda, creating those air bubbles, and the two use those air bubbles to refuel the ship. And off they go up into the throat of Squidward Tentacles, where they find that the reed of his clarinet is legitimately stuck in the walls of his esophagus. Now, I don't really know of the design of a clarinet to its fullest extent, but I can't say for sure if this entire top part of the clarinet would all in all be considered just the reed. For what I know, the reed is a separate entity, a separate piece that you put near the tip of the clarinet, which helps create that sound. That is the magic of what helps create some of these instruments to work, is a reed. And when a reed wears out, you have to replace it. So this is an entire chunk of the clarinet that is stuck within Squidward's throat. It's legitimately stuck. We even get a 2-hour title card as SpongeBob comes out of the ship with his little water wings and his flippers to just bang on this piece of the clarinet with a hammer to try to get it loose. 2 hours go by of banging this piece of clarinet with a hammer, nothing. And in what has to be the cherry on top of the Sonic the Hedgehog reference, cake, or the chili dog. It's the cheese on top of the chili, on top of the hot dog. Patrick, to bring everything full circle, brings up their dance moves from the beginning of this episode, and SpongeBob spins like a spin dash to carve through this clarinet piece in half, to cut it right in half, completely dislodging it. Squidward coughs it up, finally dislodging it from his throat, freeing him from this discomfort. But he did not cough up the two and their ship, which, of course, since Patrick had to screw things up initially, has to screw things up yet again, as we see the button that used to say shrink now says grow, and presses it while they're still inside Squidward, causing the entire ship to grow within Squidward himself. The next scene, the ending scene, is one of my favorites of the season, which, let me just say again, even with anything negative I may say about this episode, any little nitpick I can bring up, there are still moments where this episode absolutely shines. The ending bit, the ending comedic bit, is one of those shiny parts. Squidward is showing up to work at the Krusty Krab with the entire ship inside of him, with SpongeBob in tow, ready for work, although I wouldn't consider that really ready for work. How can you possibly help out at the Krusty Krab from within Squidward? But then, grossly enough, Patrick is trying to use the toilet within the submarine and brings up how it's overflowing. It's broken again. Which, I hope that none of that is seeping outside of the submarine. Now, obviously, if the submarine is like any sort of vehicle that has its own septic tank or tank underneath it to hold that kind of stuff, it's overflowing. Then it's Patrick and SpongeBob's problem more than Squidward's. But the fact that that's happening within him, that's just gross. That's gross, but that is so Nickelodeon. That is such a fantastic ending for this kind of episode. I have to applaud it. And that is the Squidtastic Voyage. It's interesting that we've had 9 episodes of this kind of parody to the Fantastic Voyage, or just that idea of going within a character's body. So I have to imagine at this point there has been another Nicktoon to feature that kind of story. So that means there's 10 somewhere out there, and I should rank them. So at some point, one of these Sundays where there used to be a This Week in Nickelodeon History, I think it would be nice to actually have a visual top 10 of the top 10 best of these. That would be nice to have. I know, add it to the pile of things I bring up. Will it or will it not actually premiere? Time will tell. But just as in time, hey, look how many references we have had to the Fantastic Voyage. And I think the Squidtastic Voyage certainly has some speed bumps along the way in terms of getting its story from point A to point B to point C, but it gets there, and I genuinely think that in those moments where it does get there, there are things and sequences that you will only find on SpongeBob, that you can only expect on SpongeBob, and it delivers in a way that it'll be stuck with you. This episode certainly has moments that will stick with you. Maybe it takes a few times. Maybe you have to watch it for almost 20 years up to this point. I have no idea, but I can tell you, Even though I mentioned that the fun in this episode of going through the insides of a character wasn't the same level of fun that you could have in other places, that doesn't mean that this is any less of a fun ride, a fun voyage. You could go to an amusement park, and of course, the adrenaline rush that you can receive from a massive roller coaster is not going to be the same as you would on a ride like a log flume. But that doesn't mean the log flume is going to be any less fun than the roller coaster. And that is going to be it for this week. And I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. I appreciate each and every one of you who are listening up to this point. Thank you for joining me on this voyage. And if you are listening up to this point and you're not already subscribed to the Captain Eric YouTube channel, that is, by all means, the best way to show your support. It is the only thing I will ever truly ask of those of you on the Ready crew, to just hit that subscribe button. Any other buttons you press on afterwards are of your own accord. If you'd like to hit that bell to be notified anytime I put something out, that is certainly up to you. If you would like to follow me on any other forms of social media, on Twitter you can find me at I'm Ready Podcast, and on Instagram at SpongeBob Podcast. You can follow those links in the podcast description below. If you would like to write into the show, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or if you have anything you'd like the captain to read out here in the air, you can send me an email at spongepodpodcast@gmail.com. That's spongepodpodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to support the captain beyond just subscribing, you can hit that Redbubble link in the podcast description below, where you can find a bunch of different Captain Eric pieces of art that you can put on a multitude of different products. Hats, t-shirts, stickers, anything that you purchase supports the captain, and anything that comes in from my projects go directly back into my projects, and it is always appreciated. I love each and every one of you. Thank you for coming aboard to another episode. Have a fantastic voyage of your own through the next week, and I will see you here next week for another episode of I'm Ready, a SpongePod Squarecast. Take us to port.
Now all you have to do is...
Get out of my body! Go!
Crow? Almost ready to open. There.
Good morning, Mr. Krabs.
Hello, Squidward. Nicktoon's trousers. What's gotten into you?
Reporting for duty, Mr. Krabs.
Squidward, the toilet's backed up again.